The wind howled like a wounded animal. Snow crashed against the windows of the cabin, thick and angry, swallowing the forest in white silence. Gerald hadn't heard a sound in hours until he did. A faint knock, then another, then the smallest voice. Outside, through the frost-covered glass, stood three boys. No shoes, no coats. Their faces pale, eyes wide with something deeper than fear. Hunger, cold, something ancient and aching. Gerald opened the door. The storm roared past his shoulder like it wanted to get inside, but he only looked at them once and moved aside. No questions, no hesitation. He had lived too long not to recognize desperation. The youngest stumbled in first, clutching the hand of the quietest one. The third boy lingered, his eyes scanning the old man like a wounded dog, not sure if the hand stretched toward him held food or fire. He followed anyway. The fireplace had been burning since morning. Gerald added more wood, ladled out soup, and wrapped them each in thick wool blankets. They didn't speak much. They couldn't. Their mouths trembled too hard, and their eyes carried stories they weren't ready to tell. They had no names, or at least none they trusted him with, so Gerald gave them new ones. The silent one, with eyes that watched everything, became Jamie, the boy with the guarded shoulders and sharp glare, Rafael, and the one who clung closest to the fire. Eyes flicking between the other two for reassurance, he called Toby. He didn't ask where they came from, but the bruises under their sleeves, the way they flinched when he moved too quickly, those things spoke louder than words. Gerald was no stranger to pain, even if he hadn't always known how to fix it. Still, he tried. He let them sleep on his floor, made more soup, turned off the radio so the static wouldn't startle them. Days passed. The storm held the cabin hostage. Gerald didn't mind. It gave him more time to keep them warm, but peace never lasts forever. A knock came again this time, harder. Not children, but men, uniformed, tired eyes behind dark glasses. They weren't searching for runaways. They were searching for illegal miners' refugees from a migrant camp that had scattered into the woods during the blizzard. Gerald told them he hadn't seen anyone. They didn't believe him. One of the boys, Rafael, stepped out, tried to run. He didn't get far. Another officer grabbed him hard. When Gerald tried to intervene, they warned him he could be arrested for harboring undocumented miners. Aiding fugitives, they said. But what he saw wasn't fugitives. He saw boys with no one else in the world. He saw what it meant to be abandoned and what a single night of kindness might mean. He begged for time, just one night more, just to keep them safe until he could get help that wouldn't send them back into danger. The compromise came in whispers. A woman at the local church connected him with a youth shelter affiliated with a community center one that didn't ask too many questions if children came alone. It wasn't perfect, but it was safer. The morning they left, snow still piled against the cabin walls. Toby, the smallest, hugged him tightly. His hands were trembling. His voice cracked as he looked up into the old man's eyes and whispered, "If I had a dad, I wish it was you." Gerald didn't answer. He only nodded, watched them disappear into the waiting van, then shut the door behind him. The silence returned, but this time it stayed for years. And somewhere beyond that snowstorm, three boys would carry one old man's warmth in their bones. Want to know how the storm changed their lives forever? Follow the journey in part 2, and don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful true life tales told with heart. Time stretched far from that winter in the woods. The snow melted, the cabin stood silent, and the boys, once huddled in blankets, stepped into new lives, cities, and truths they carried like quiet luggage. Jamie moved east. New York swallowed him whole, but he stayed, found silence in its noise. He didn't speak much, but he wrote lines that cut through corruption, articles that held institutions accountable. His voice existed in print, never on stages, never on screens. But his name became known in the corners where injustice feared the light. His writing often touched the LGBT community, not always directly, but with a kind of trembling clarity. When priests abused, when shelters turned away boys like he once was, when laws erased love with a single signature, Jamie's words remained unemotional, sharp, and honest. Rafael headed west. Los Angeles took him in. He wore a badged now patrol uniform, radio on his shoulder. He rarely smiled, rarely spoke of his past. His co-workers knew little beyond the job. None of them asked who he dated, and Rafael never gave them a reason to wonder. He played the part they expected, strong, silent, unshakable. But inside, he carried two battles, one against crime, one against himself. The fear of being outed in a department that still whispered slurs behind closed doors sat heavier than his gun belt. And then there was Toby. Seattle suited him. Rain made him feel less alone. He had known since his teens who he was, and he had never hidden it. Toby came out at 18 not for applause, not to rebel, but because silence had once almost killed him. He refused to wear it again. He studied law, spoke at rallies, joined organizations that defended those left behind. His face appeared on magazine covers, pride campaigns, courthouse steps. He was young, openly gay, and unafraid, and he remembered every night he had spent on the cabin floor. Jamie, distant but dependable, and Toby, passionate and loud, crossed paths again during a federal case involving same-sex couples denied the right to adopt. A church-run agency had dismissed a gay couple's application without review. Toby led the legal team. Jamie investigated the agency's federal funding. It wasn't planned, but it felt inevitable. They worked side by side for weeks, never needing to name what bonded them. In a quiet moment after a long day in court, a journalist asked Toby how he had found his calling. He didn't pause. He didn't prepare the answer. He simply looked into the lens and said, "The first time I felt safe being who I am was in a wooden cabin with an old man who didn't ask questions, just gave me soup and let me sleep." The clip went viral in advocacy circles. It was clipped, quoted, echoed. But the name Gerald never came up. Toby hadn't said it. He hadn't needed to. Some truths are sacred. Behind the recognition, the victories, the polished titles and city addresses, three men still carried pieces of a single storm. They had come out separately, unevenly, painfully, but they had all come out, one by one, and whether they knew it or not, they were still walking towards something they hadn't yet named, something that waited for them in the trees. The winters had grown quieter. Gerald's steps were slower now, his hands more fragile, but the cabin still stood stubborn as ever under the shadow of the Cascades. At 83, he asked for little, a working generator, a few good books, the sound of wind moving through pine needles like old memories. His name was long forgotten outside the valley. No family, no children, only the occasional letter from someone named Toby, always signed without a return address. Still, he remembered every name he had ever given. The snow began to fall early that year, not thick like it used to, but sharp and thin like needles from a sky that no longer waited for seasons to finish. The men came at noon. They wore safety vests and smiles that didn't reach their eyes, clipboard in hand. One of them introduced himself as a land surveyor, assigned to check soil quality for upcoming infrastructure plans. Gerald let them in. He wasn't suspicious. He had been a ranger once. He believed in forests, in neighbors, in the quiet dignity of land being left alone. They measured the floor, took photos of the old fireplace, and asked strange questions about property deeds, mental health, and his capacity to manage decisions. When Gerald pushed back, the tone shifted. The questions turned into statements. The land was being considered for development. New roads, new cabins, vacation homes for outsiders who'd never seen a real winter. And he, they said, was standing in the way. Gerald tried to explain that his papers were in order, that the cabin was his, legally and rightfully, but one of them pulled out a document typed, notarized, stamped, It claimed he had already agreed to a transfer of ownership. The signature looked like his, but he had never held that pen. When he refused to sign the final release, things turned violent. He didn't remember the fall, only the sharp crack of his head against the wooden floor, blood staining the rug. The sound of boots retreating, then silence. Hours passed. The fireplace dimmed. It was the neighbor, a quiet man named Edwin, who found him. He brought hot broth and called the local clinic. Gerald waved him off, said he tripped over the chair, but Edwin had lived there too long not to see through stories. Later that night, Edwin reviewed the footage from the motion camera he'd mounted on the edge of his barn. It wasn't high resolution, but it was enough. The timestamp matched. The faces were clear, the aggression unmistakable. Edwin didn't go to the sheriff. Not yet. Instead, he mailed a copy of the footage to a name he'd seen once scribbled on a letter stuck to Gerald's fridge. It was faded, curled at the edges. Barely legible, Toby, Seattle. 3 days passed before the footage reached Toby's hands. He watched it once, then again, then he called Jamie. Jamie didn't ask questions. He just forwarded the video to a friend at a legal watchdog group. Within an hour, it was flagged for further review. By nightfall, Rafael had seen it too. He recognized one of the men. Not a surveyor, not an engineer, a local lawyer, Brian Dalton, nephew of the Cedar Brook mayor previously tied to shady land acquisitions across Oregon. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Gerald had no family listed in public records, no internet presence, no legal team. He was the perfect target, but what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to find out, was that 3 men still carried his name, hidden deep in their histories. And now they would carry it into the light. The storm had returned, but this time it wasn't snow falling over a wooden cabin. It was justice, gathering in the distance. The courtroom in Cedar Brook wasn't built for history. A single-floor building with sun-stained wood panels and flickering fluorescent lights. It had hosted decades of petty disputes, noise complaints, parking infractions, quiet divorces. But that morning, something different stirred beneath the old ceiling tiles. 3 men entered, not all at once, but close enough for the air to shift. Toby walked in first, his suit crisp, briefcase in hand, his steps sharp with purpose. The clerk barely looked up before recognizing the name Tobias Jameson, lead counsel for the plaintiff. Behind him came Jamie, silent as ever, a press badge clipped discreetly to his coat pocket. He took a seat near the back, but his eyes never left the front bench. Minutes later, Rafael entered, still in civilian clothes. His badge had been suspended the day before for conflict of interest. He wore the suspension like armor. The room had no idea who they were, but they knew exactly why they had come. The case had moved quickly, too quickly. On paper, it was about contested ownership. Gerald, the defendant, had allegedly signed over the land weeks prior. His signature, notarized. The documents, sealed, but the evidence said otherwise. The medical report from his injury, the inconsistencies in the timestamp, the security footage that captured not only the assault, but the faces of those who had delivered it. And then there was Toby's motion, filed just before the hearing. It included an injunction against the development permit, a demand for forensic handwriting analysis, and a formal complaint against Brian Dalton for abuse of influence and conspiracy to defraud. Dalton didn't show up in court that day. His lawyers did. They came dressed in arrogance, waving paperwork and casting doubt on Gerald's mental state. They claimed he had a history of confusion, that he had once reported seeing children in the woods that weren't there. They leaned into the stereotype of the old man in the forest, lonely, senile, broken by time, but they didn't know what Toby had brought with him. He stood to deliver closing remarks, the room still, the lights humming above. He did not speak of laws first. He spoke of winter, of a night when 3 boys unnamed, undocumented, and invisible had found shelter not in a system, not in a shelter, but in a cabin. He described soup, a fire, A man who didn't ask questions, didn't demand answers. A man who had nothing but warmth and gave all of it anyway. And then he reached into his folder and pulled out an old clip, grainy but clear, a younger Gerald, caught on a decades-old camera, wrapping blankets around 3 trembling children, his voice faint in the snowstorm, murmuring, "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you tonight." He let the silence settle after the footage stopped, then said nothing more. The judge looked up, and that's when Jamie stood. No announcement, no spectacle. He simply walked to the witness stand, placed a hand on the railing, and stated his name. He was asked to confirm his relationship to the defendant. He said only this man raised 3 gay sons, and we're here because he never asked us to be anything but ourselves. There were no gasps, no cameras flashing, just the quiet break of something invisible, some barrier, long held. Rafael followed, stepping into the light without a badge, without a shield, only with the truth. He confirmed the presence of a known legal manipulator at the scene. He cited past disciplinary complaints buried under political favors. The 3 of them, now grown, stood as one. No longer boys sheltered by kindness, but men defending the man who had given it without condition. By the end of the hearing, the judge didn't issue a ruling. He said he needed time, but everyone in the room knew something had shifted. Gerald sat in the corner, older, frailer, but not alone. For the first time in years, the storm wasn't closing in, it was passing. The snow melted slowly that spring. The verdict arrived in quiet words on official paper. Gerald Bennett retained full rights to his land. The forged transfer was voided. Brian Dalton was under investigation. The permits were revoked. But the victory was never just legal. It was something else. A few weeks later, they returned to the cabin not as clients or plaintiffs, but as sons. Jamie brought tools. Rafael brought lumber. Toby brought a blueprint. Together, they worked through the thawing days, repairing what had been broken, not just by time or violence, but by years of solitude. They rebuilt the porch. They restored the chimney. They painted the walls a soft color Gerald never would have chosen himself, but he didn't argue. He only watched and smiled. Then came the sign, installed with quiet ceremony, just above the cabin's old door frame, carved into oak and stained dark with care. Gerald House, a safe place for who you are. It wasn't just a name, it was a beginning. With support from Toby's law firm and funding raised through Jamie's foundation, the cabin was transformed into a community refuge for LGBTQ+ youth in rural Oregon. 1 room for shelter, 1 for counseling, 1 for quiet, just in case someone needed to sit by the fire and breathe. Volunteers came, so did stories. Kids who had run, kids who had been kicked out, kids who had never seen kindness without a price. The Gerald House became something steady like the old man who once opened the door without a word. But not all truths come easily. It was Jamie who found it, buried in a legal box sent from the shelter archives, the place where the boys had been taken decades ago. An old intake form, smudged handwriting, and a note pinned to a tattered scarf. His name is Toby. Please don't let him be forgotten. His father's name was Gerald. No surname, no return address, no phone number, just a name. Gerald didn't speak when they told him. He sat for a long time, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the woods beyond the window. Then, quietly, he said, "I always wondered why he looked back that morning." The others walked straight to the van, but Toby, he looked back, like he already knew. It hadn't been planned. Gerald had never known he had a child. The woman, someone from a long ago summer, never serious, never returned, had disappeared before he ever found out. And somewhere along the way, she must have sent their son to find safety. But the road broke, the storm came. The boy was lost until he wasn't. Toby said nothing at first. He just sat beside Gerald on the porch, where the floorboards creaked under the weight of memory. Later, at the dedication ceremony, He stood with Jamie and Rafael as dozens gathered under the tall trees. Local news cameras blinked red. Children whispered to each other in sleeping bags. Volunteers carried folding chairs and plastic cups of lemonade. Toby took the mic last. He didn't mention the lawsuit, or the trial, or the violence. He spoke of a wooden cabin, of a man who didn't care where they came from, of being wrapped in a wool blanket and told, "You're safe now." He spoke of a kind of fatherhood not bound by blood, but by presence, by gentleness, by choice. And then he paused, looked at Gerald, and said quietly, "He didn't raise us to be like him. He raised us to be more ourselves. That's what fathers do." The applause was soft. Some cried, some smiled, but Gerald just looked at him, the boy he'd once named, the man he now called son. And Toby leaned close, barely a whisper, a sentence meant for no one else. "I found my way back, Dad." The trees didn't move, but somehow the wind felt warmer. Have you ever been shaped by someone who wasn't family but loved you like one? Share your story below. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story for more real stories that restore faith in humanity.